Alright, so I want to have a bit of a chat about metal casting. The melting down and casting of metals can be dated back around about the 4th century BC, so it's been around a while, and not a great deal has actually changed in the overall concept of what's going on. Essentially all you're doing is heating up metal until it reaches its liquid state, and then pouring it into a mould so that when it solidifies, you end up with a solid metal piece. But really what I want to talk about is a technique that I think I've come up with, and I just want to put it out there to the wider community, to anybody who thinks it might be useful for them. If you've been following my videos, you may have seen recently that I've got myself a 3D printer, and I've printed out a little skull that I've then replicated in the metal. But for anybody that knows anything about casting, you might be looking at that and going, how did he get the undercuts and the hollow of the eyes and all that sort of stuff in a shape like that and still be able to cast it in one piece? So on or off for the last 18 months or so, I've been experimenting with a different method of getting these sort of complicated shapes. I had my first success with it with the Thor's Hammer project, where I was working out the really complicated Celtic sort of patterns on the side. And I'm now at a point where I think I've worked out the recipe and the order of operations well enough that I can sort of share it with you guys, and hopefully other people out there can make use of it. The recipe itself is pretty straightforward. It's really just a one-to-one recipe of the coal dust, bentonite clay, and as fine a grit sand as you can. So that's your one-to-one mix. Dry mix together everything so there's no marbling in it. It's all just one consistent colour. And then you add the water to it to get the consistency that you want. This can either be left as a dry powder, or once it's mixed it can be put in a plastic bag, and it can stay in a plastic bag for a considerable amount of time before it dries out. If you're wondering, you can do this recipe without the coal dust, but you probably won't get as high a degree of detail in the mould pieces that you create. I'm going to set this stuff aside and keep it dry because I don't need to use any at the moment, but I have already made some up to give you an idea of what you're going for. When you do mix the water into this, you want to keep a little bit of dry sand on hand that you can add into the recipe, and that will cut down the stickiness of it, kind of in the same way that if you were making biscuit dough, you'd add a little bit of extra flour to it to dry it out a little bit. And what we are making is very similar in consistency to that sort of biscuit dough sort of analogy. It's very similar in feel to a Play-Doh or plasticine sort of feeling, and kind of feels a lot like what you'd expect plasticine to feel like if you sort of mixed it up with sand. The biggest thing with this is you can see that as I'm squashing this, it's not sticking to me. It's leaving a bit of black residue behind, but that's just from the coal dust. But the point being is I can shape this and fold it and do all that sort of stuff with it. It is very moldable. Normally when I'm working with this stuff, I use the graphite powder, but to give you a better idea of what I'm doing and so you can see what I'm doing, I'm just using talcum powder. And this is a perfectly good alternative if you don't have access to the graphite. So I'll replicate what I did with the skull there to give you an idea. But this could just as easily be any other part that has a sort of complicated undercut or shape to it. When this is finished up, we want the overall thickness of the shell that we're going to create to not be more than about 1/2 centimetre thick. Any more than that, and the moisture that this retains can create bubbling issues in the mould. So you want to start out with it being probably twice as thick as you need, and just break off a piece that looks about right in terms of what you need for coverage. You want to get the piece relatively smooth before you start on this. You don't want to have any cracks around the outside edge. It's pretty uninclined to crack. It does hold itself together pretty well, but you want to make sure that any cracks that do appear in the squashing down of it, you just push them back into the surface so that you don't have any cracks to begin with. Once you've got it to the point where you're just about ready to use it, you want to think along the lines of, in this instance, I'm going for the most detailed areas first, so that's going to go face down. You want to dust down the piece that you're using and the stuff pretty liberally. If you polish that into the surface of it, you'll find that that will become even smoother, and it really cuts down any likelihood of that sticking to your pattern piece. So again, make sure your piece is nicely covered. If you've got an old makeup brush or a very light paintbrush, that'll help for that as well. And then what we'd want to do is start pressing it into the mould. Press the piece in so you're picking up all those details. At this point, you can even just take that out and see if it's starting to pick it up. Providing you're not getting any areas that stick, you can just put that back in and continue with the process. Now, the thing with this now is that you will see that it starts to crack as we go. That doesn't matter. All we need to do is chase it across the surface, and as soon as those cracks appear, just sort of repair them on the spot by just pressing them back down again. And you want to chase this entirely over the entire piece until you start marrying up at the back. Okay, so I'm just going to work this over, just working it around, pushing it around as I go. Even these bits here can be pushed forward. You can see it's starting to come together at the back. Move that again. And I'm literally just moving it across the surface. And see how it's going. Until that closes up. And pinching it all up. Again, just making sure I've got no cracks across the surface of it, that it's all packed down really nicely. Now what I want to do is make sure that the overall consistency is quite good, so it's a bit thicker at the front. So I'm going to lose some of that material off there. Again, that can be set aside and reused. I'm just thinning that down all the way around. Once I'm pretty happy with the overall shape of it and it feels like the thickness of that shell is relatively consistent across the surface. Obviously it's going to be a little bit thicker here because that's where the eye sockets are, but that doesn't matter. Now I want to dust that down again. Just to make sure that I've got no stickiness on the outside surface area of it. Now the beauty with this is that normally speaking, if this was a lost wax process, for instance, you would do that as an investment piece, or you would do it in a solid piece, and then you would have to cook out or melt out that section so that you had a cavity area. What I've worked out with this is because this has that putty, that soft consistency, I can manipulate this mold whilst it's still soft to be able to get that piece out and then put the mold back together in such a way that it retains its shape. Then I can think about the drying process with the piece absent from the mold, which means I haven't destroyed my pattern piece in the molding process, and as well as that, it's far quicker than having to melt it out. Plus you don't need kilns and you don't need that sort of thing as well. Because this has ended up being like a putty, it cuts really nicely and it leaves a nice clean edge, which means that edge can be brought back together really cleanly as well. So all I need to do is exactly what I did with these ones. This is the raw casting. There's absolutely no cleanup in that one at all, and you can see it's had a very minor couple of bleed issues, but for the most part that is a really sharp seam line when it comes to metal casting. If this was a more complicated piece, I might run this in 4 sections, or I might run it in 3, or whatever was necessary. In this instance though, because it's not super complicated, I can run across the top of the skull with the knife to the other side. Now normally that in itself wouldn't be any good to us because the details are such that they still want to grip onto the pattern piece inside, but because this stuff is quite soft, I can sort of flex it away from the piece, and you can see how it opens up there, and that will just separate out, and you can see our little guy there. Do that same thing with the back half of him. Now all I need to do is just get a very small amount of moisture, and because that has a very high clay content, I can bring those halves together, and yes, believe it or not, that will just re-glue back together and hold its shape as one piece. So before I finish this off, I just want to clean those seams up a little bit, so I'm just brushing them across, again just with a little tiny bit of moisture. Now at this point there's probably a lot of people out there that do metal casting that go, well, there's way too much moisture content in that, and they would be absolutely correct. If I was to pour molten metal into that now, it would bubble and carry on, and it would not work as a mold very well at all, and it would end up with a very bubbly piece. So to avoid that bubbling issue and sort of keep those nice details that we're after, fire up a little handheld gas torch, give that a really light sort of flaming over, just to sort of bake that outer shell just a little bit. You don't want to go crazy with it. If you go crazy with it, you will distort the mold. If you see tiny little cracks appearing like the cracks in a dry riverbed, you're going too far. It really only needs a very light heat. Once you've done that, you need to flip it over and do the same thing on the inside. Obviously make sure you're not burning yourself, get some gloves or whatever. Heat it up on the inside there. Again, really only to the point where you're heating up the inside area. You just want to get that surface area on the inside of the mold heated up to the point where it's ready to be used. And ideally, whilst you're getting this sort of stuff ready, you've got your metal heating up in the background and it's getting close to being ready to be poured. This is designed to be a very rapid process, and to give you an idea, I prepped up 3 of these pieces just whilst I was waiting for the metal to heat up. The final thing to do is to prep that so that you're not getting any sand in there. Easiest way to do that is to just get some aluminium foil, put it over the top, and then wrap the entire thing inside it like that. Flatten that area down there like that. Then what you want to do is put that in a tin can or something that holds the right size. Fill it up to about halfway with the sand. Put the piece in there like that. Get yourself a piece of aluminium tube. Aluminium tube is better because it'll all fuse together. You can use metal if you want to just cut it off. Sit the piece of metal tube there like that. Fill it up the rest of the way so that it fully covers the top part, and ideally halfway up the tube as well. This mug's a bit small, obviously. You really want to cover it up to probably about that sort of height there. And then from there, you're ready to pour the metal. Aluminium foil stops the sand from falling into the mould, but will also melt instantly as soon as that molten metal goes down there. Now keep in mind the sand that I am packing around here is the normal green sand, so that it does hold shape and does hold moisture, so it won't collapse in there. You can't use just outright dry sand. Obviously when the molten metal goes through, there's a pretty high likelihood that it will collapse into the mould along with the molten metal. Just make sure that the sand itself is mixed with a little bit of the clay so that it holds its shape and it does have some moisture to it. And what you end up with is that. So essentially that is the method. The complexity of it really just comes down to the individual pieces that you're working on. It does work exceptionally well for flat surface areas like it did on the side of Thor's hammer, and it will work fairly well for doing up cores as well, but you can't use this as a solid piece for a core itself. If you're making up core pieces, you'd probably want to do a different mix. This is really only for creating pieces that has a shell thickness, as I said, probably no more than 1/2 centimetre thick. Any more than that and it retains too much moisture and it bubbles. Couple of final tips. I've recently been casting up bits and pieces, as you know. Had a quick go at using the same technique for the inside piece of the pump action, and I did make a mistake with it, which is why this piece hasn't worked, and you can see that it is very bubbly on the inside. That's that moisture blowout that I was talking about. That came from me trying something different rather than trying the technique that I'd found tried and true. Long story short, the gas bottle had run out, so I just used a hot air gun. Hot air gun, it's just not sufficient. You really need to have something that's a more focused flame that can bake off that surface layer. As I said, you don't want to be heating it so much that cracks starting to appear, but you obviously do need to heat it up to the point where that first sort of even 1/2 millimetre or so on the surface is basically completely dry. But anyway guys, that might be something new when it comes to metal casting. I've certainly not seen anybody doing anything similar to it, so hopefully that's a technique that somebody out there can make use of, and I'd love to hear from you if you get some benefit from it or if you make any refinements on the idea. So thanks for watching guys, talk to you next time.